G'day, welcome to the Financial Bloke Podcast, the podcast for people seeking the wisdom needed to grow their family's wealth and live a happier, healthier and more prosperous life. My name's Ben Law and I am the Financial Bloke. G'day everyone and welcome back to the Financial Blokes Wealth and Wisdom Podcast. Today we're tackling one of my favourite topics, communication. So if you can just stay with me for a few minutes, I'm going to pitch to you why you need to stay tuned for the episode today. Why is it that some families on the land seem to thrive and really prosper while others struggle? And why do so few families manage to maintain that success across multiple generations and others seem to do it for one or two and then things just fall apart at the seams? And they fall prey to what I call the 3-generation curse: 2 to make it and 1 to lose it. In my experience, about 60% of the reason is a breakdown in trust and communication within the family unit. I'm sure you've all been there. You've struggled to communicate with someone in the family or a friend, and over time, things just don't seem to fit anymore. And ultimately, trust gets eroded. Communication breakdown over time, I reckon's just like plaque building up on your teeth. You don't see it building up from day to day, but 5 years later, you're at the dentist and they're jackhammering the plaque from the back of your teeth like there's no tomorrow. Today, I'm excited to say we're going to tackle this topic of communication with a communication and language expert, and I've been waiting to get this guest on for a couple of years now. So who is this expert, you might well ask? Her name's Katie Godden. Katie grew up on a farm in northwest New South Wales. She spent a decade in the education system as a teacher. She studied NLP extensively, and for the lack of a better term, she's a communication and language expert. She coaches people on how to become a better communicator, especially in the health space. Katie's driven. She's a hardworking mum, and she balances being a businesswoman with raising a family, which includes 2 young larrikin boys. Katie knows her stuff. She's lots of fun, and she's known to me as Auntie Kit because she's my sister. So without further delay, welcome Auntie Kit.
Hey, thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Now we're going to get stuck right into things at the moment. We're not going to mess around the edges, but Katie, we learn different skills in our life all the time, and we think nothing of learning how to, say, use a new computer program, how to benchmark our business, how to invest off farm, how to get a better yield in our crop, etc. But very few people would ever consider learning how to be a better communicator when in just about every area of our business and personal lives, communication impacts it for the better or worse. Now, to kick this off, for everyone listening, can you just give us your pitch on why improving your communication skills is so important?
It's such a travesty when we talk about the fact that people are not investing in their communication and in that, because for me, communication and the way in which we speak, we move, we interact with people is the cornerstone of our existence. It is the thread that weaves us all together, and whether it weaves us together or cracks us apart depends all upon the skills in which we have and how we can navigate challenges, how we can navigate joy, how we can navigate uncertainty, how we can bring people together, how we can actually go and accelerate personally and professionally. And so for me, the cornerstone of every relationship, every interaction, every aspect of our business, of our personal life is communication, full stop.
Yeah, and I mean, family, within the family unit, your friends, in business. I mean, I had this conversation with someone the other day who said, well, Ben, I don't own a business. I just work for someone. And I'm like, well, how to communicate better with your boss to get a raise, or how to deal with someone in the business that you're working with that might be a bit of a drongo, but how to communicate better with them to avoid those situations. So I think it's one of the most important skills. And, I talked about in the intro, Katie, about how, my research and the experience is about 60% of family succession plans on the farm fail because of a breakdown in communication and then a loss of trust. So if you look at that from a statistical point of view, it's one of the most important factors, but very few people do it. How did you get to the point in your career where you considered communication, or where you got to the point where you said, I'm going to devote my life to learning to become an expert communicator?
So You're right, though. I love that word devotion. And it really is a devotion to be a better communicator. And the reason is why is because I want really profound relationships. What I realized is, being in the education sector for over 20 years has really shown me that it wasn't a priority for me at the time. So what we find a lot of people do is they really work on the specialist skill that they have. So if we think about the ag industry, if they're an agronomist, they work on that specialty, like actually being really highly skilled in that space. If it's someone who's about the mechanics, the machinery, if it's someone about the production, whatever aspect of life, they focus in and they hone in solely on the skill of that expertise, that specialty. Now, what I've found for myself personally was that the way that I got better results, the way that I had better engagement, the way that I got better outcomes for the kids that I was teaching, so primary school teacher by trade, moving into helping people with anxiety and mindset work, to then coaching people in business and now ultimately training, the pattern is familiar. And I'm sure that your listeners will understand this as well, that when you're having a conversation with your children, with your brothers and sisters, with your aunties and uncles, with those who you're dealing with on, maybe it's the dog food supplier, maybe it's who's giving you your fertilizer, a trucking company. It doesn't matter where it is, that if there's a miscommunication or if there's communication that isn't thoughtful and mindful, then it can lead us in a number of directions and we get to choose. Right? We get to choose. Is this communication going to either break us or make us? Is this communication going to disconnect or is it going to reconnect? Is this communication going to actually resonate with that person? Because here's what I've realized over the years and over what I've done through education, through my own emotional mindset journey, through having a relationship with my husband and now having teenage children in the house, what I've realized is that communication is definitely a two-way street. And we know that, right? We have communication. The missing link my whole way through, which made me realize that this was a necessity, not just a luxury, but a necessity, just as much as our skill set in agriculture, our skill set in our field, that this needs to be exquisite for everybody, was the fact that it's either going to resonate or it's going to miss the mark. And when it missed the marks, it drives us apart. Like you said before, we lose trust. Then we build resentment. And then from that resentment builds all sorts of different behaviors that come through. And everybody is a giver and a receiver. And this, for me, there was a moment in my career where I knew language and communication was a skill set of mine because I'd studied NLP and I went deep into neuro-linguistic programming, which is basically just studying excellence in communication and behavior. And so when it came to me looking at this, there was a moment where Dad was really sick and he was choosing between people who were going to help him be well. Now, he'd worked on this for a little while and I'm sure he won't mind me sharing. And if he does, apologies, Dad, love you, is the fact that depending on what specialist he went to would depend on whether he understood it and whether he would follow through. Now, I noticed in my health journey, and this is why I'm passionate about the health space, is that there were doctors and specialists and people who were really exquisite in their field working with me, and I would either do it or I wouldn't. And so I started to follow the breadcrumbs of like, well, what is it that makes this person inspire me or empower me to actually make the change that I need in my health? For those of you who don't know, I experienced type 1 diabetes, and so this has been a journey of it'll be 38 years this year. And so what I realized is that people receive information differently. Just like when we're on the UHF, when I was a little girl, I used to sit on Dad's lap and we'd talk to Mum back at the house from the tractor. And just if we're not quite tuned into that right station, we're going to talk to a truckie that's like 3 hours away, rather than Mum who's in the house just a couple of paddocks away. And so if we can fine tune and understand what channel are these people on, how are they receiving the information, and what is it that I can do in order to help this communication flow freely at the right frequency between us? Does that make sense?
Perfect sense. Perfect. So do you believe that people are born good or bad communicators? Today's episode is brought to you by AgriCoach. You've worked bloody hard over the years and you've built a solid operation. But as your children grow up and start their own journeys, you're beginning to think about the next 5, 10, and even 15 years and how to keep driving the business forward and ensure a smooth and successful succession plan. Preparing the business, preparing the next generation, and preparing for your eventual retirement all requires a solid plan and a proven process. Unsure about the right steps to take? Head on over to agricoach.com.au/webinar to learn more about our Succession Proof Your Family webinar. AgriCoach, aligning families, growing wealth, and protecting legacies. And now, let's get back to the episode.
I don't believe in good or bad. I believe that we come out as a clean slate and we are educated on what is believed to be the best by the environment in which we're in. So what do I mean by that? Our communication is influenced by what we experience from young people. So 0 to 7 is what we call the imprint period. And that's where we are like a brand new phone that has the basics on it, but we get to download and we get to put on that phone any of the apps that we want. So you might have like the weather app, you might have a music app, you might have Facebook or Instagram or whatever it is that's on there. Is that depending on who we're around at that stage, so the level of communication our parents have, the level of communications our siblings have, the school system, what we're watching on TV, all of that influences the way in which we communicate. Now, does it appear to be that some people have a greater flexibility in communication? Yes. Why? Maybe because they've experienced it, maybe because they've worked on it unconsciously, so not knowing that they're working on it, but working unconsciously, because we say that people have the gift of the gab. It's a common saying, isn't it? And people have the gift of the gab. It's not a gift.
It's a skill that's been learned.
Yes, 1000%. It is a skill that is being learned. And I know if I look at different moments of my life, from when I was a kid to when I'd go to heifer shows and be in the ag industry, to when I was an educator and a teacher, to where I am today, is that the evolution of my communication has been outstanding. And it's not just because I've winged it. It's because I've purposely wanted to improve my communication so that I have a better connection and better relationships with the people I'm with, whether it's in business, whether it's in my personal life. It gets to excel, and therefore I get to have a better life. So do they. And so for me, it's a win-win.
Well, also too, I think a really important point to point out from the financial bloke's point of view is if you're running a business, you've got a family business, like a family farming operation, better communication means a greater chance of growing and building your wealth and making more money.
Yeah.
It comes down to, the family part is super important, and communication, it's pretty obvious. If you've got a family, you communicate well, you get on well, you have a loving, happy family that's able to deal with conflict as and when it comes up. But the other side is if you communicate well as a family or with your service suppliers, your employees, your family and friends, there's a far greater chance that you're going to make far more profit. And one of the things that I listened where you said there, Kate, which really resonated with me is there's a giver of communication and then there's a receiving of communication. And I think that's a really important point, because I see people all the time, they'll say, I'm a reasonable communicator, but my bloody brother or my sister or my dad, he's a shit communicator. And, he's got the problem, or mum's got the problem, or my daughter's got the problem, not me. Now, I argue with them and I say, well, you can't change them, but you can bloody well change you. Do you believe that as well, Kate, that you should focus on yourself first and not others?
It is pivotal that we focus on ourselves, because the only thing, when we look at locus of control, the only thing that we have real control over is us. It's us. And you know what, when you said about like family is the major component. Right? You live with them, you breathe it, it's everything. You're with them 24 hours a day. If we're not working on the communication from within ourselves and with ourselves, then this is where it can become unsteady, because it's not just the communication we have with those people with us. The communication we have with others is highly influenced by the communication that we have with ourselves. So that inner dialogue, that the conversation that you have when you're not actually speaking, but it's all happening in here. And we all We've all been there. We all know it. That's on the go. And that conversation, it's really important that we're aware of that and we're aware of the impact that that has on us mentally and emotionally, as well as the impact that has on how do we speak with everyone outside of us, because that's the part we want to really be. What I always talk to my prackies about, the people that I help, is we want to become the most flexible communicator, because the most flexible communicator achieves what they want in life and does it from a place of fulfillment and happiness.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And look, I remember someone said to me years ago, Katie, that under pressure, we default to our lowest level of training. And so if we haven't trained ourselves to be good at communication, and as I said, receiving that communication from someone else, but also giving communication out or interacting, we under pressure, we default. And if you look at family business, especially farming or agribusiness type setups, there's a lot of pressure. So we're going to default back. So I think it's getting that education and ability to be able to train yourself up to do better is a very, very important thing. But I want to come back to that, what's going on in our head in a few minutes. I've got a question there I'd like to dig in. But at the moment, if we can just go back to, talking about families, because I think families are often, not always, a breeding ground of very poor communication. And I'm not sure why. But like I said in the intro, it's like plaque on your teeth. Resentment and frustration builds up slowly over time without you even noticing it. And as I said before, people start to think that it's other people's problems. So if you wanted to start becoming a better communicator, just maybe to start practicing, how do you start that journey? Okay.
Of course, we have a lot of the elements hit us and it can send us in different levels of thought processes and have different interactions. But if we think about it, the sun, when it comes out, it's beautiful and it helps things grow and it nourishes and it really brings the fire and it brings things to life. Too much sun, though, creates drought, creates the desert, burns things. We think about that side of it. Then we have water, and water works in a particular way. So it rains, or we've got streams, we've got irrigation, whatever it might be. If we think about the land needs different things. It needs different nutrients, different fertilizers, chemicals. It needs different production and ways of thinking around it. That's why we get agronomists. And when we think about also even the air, the breeze is beautiful because it allows the pollens to go. But if it's a gusting wind, it can remove the topsoil of the land. And when it comes to communications in families, most importantly, is coming to the realization that what we actually have is within our family, we have different elements. And it's knowing about how does that particular element need me to work with it. So if you're going to work with the land, you know that there's particular things you need to do in order to get the best yield or the best results from the land. If you're going to work with the sun, you need to know the best time of year to plant. You need to know when do you put that in and how far down into the soil do you put it. If you're going to be working with the water, how much does it actually need and what direction do we want it gushing, or do we just want like a little sprinkle over the top? What is it that's needed? And so when it comes to us looking at our internal communication with our family, with a family unit, and how do we start to look at that, we need to look at, well, what does the other person need as well? What does that other person need and what is it that's going on for me? So it's really about a place of self-discovery, understanding how does their computer system, if we go back to what you said at the very beginning, Ben, which was about the computer system or a computer system where there's inputs and outputs. It's exactly the same in the human mind. They hear something, see something, feel something with their senses. Now, we only gather 128 bits of that information and do something with it. Now, the inside of us, so when it comes into our mind, do our eyes actually see it? Do our ears actually hear it? No. Our mind interprets it. And so we have to understand what is the interpretation mechanism that actually is going on inside that person's thinking to get that output. So what do I mean by that? If you speak and you say something to someone or you're having a conversation, notice what happens after they've heard it. Because that starts to show you what's going on in their internal representation of that. How are they interpreting what you've just delivered to them? Because how every single person interprets information, how they receive it, is different to each other's. And so if we can just start noticing, I say these things, this is the response I get from this person. I don't like this response. Great. Stop yourself. I wonder how else I could say it so that they can understand it. We talk about Stephen Covey, who says to always seek to understand, then to be understood. And this is exactly what we're talking about here. Seek to understand what's going on inside that person's world. Quite often what happens in communication is, and in family dynamics, is you have a parent who values particular things, and then you have a child who values particular things. And there's a mismatch. And so the parent is talking to the child from what's important to them, without taking into consideration, well, how does that impact what's important to that child in order to get that result? And so if we can just start noticing, like, number one, just notice what happens when you communicate a particular way with someone. What's the behavior on the outside? That's one way. If I could answer it from another angle too, what I'd love to say is how much time, I'd love you just to reflect, your listeners to reflect on this. And this is something I ask people all the time, and it's so important to think about, is how often do you make a statement rather than a question in your communication? We're being trained all the time to be a statement community. We are taught through social media, we make statements. We are taught through listening to books, people make statements. There's not a lot of questioning that goes in. And when we're made statements to, what does it feel like? If someone talks at you, how does it feel? Especially if it's about a tough topic, we're under stress, we're under all these things. Like, how do you feel?
Unheard,
unsupported, right? Like you're just nothing, like you're not valued, like you're, actually meant to be in partnership, but am I? I don't know. And so there's this uncertainty and this doubt that can come. Whereas if we come from a place of curiosity, and this is one of the greatest gifts you can give yourself, is the gift of curiosity. So actually being curious. Oh, tell me more about that. Oh, hang on, you've just said something. I'm not quite sure what you mean by X. Could you just explain it a little bit more, or could you walk me through it?
I think that's a really important point, because a couple of things, usually when there's a bit of a dust up, and it doesn't have to be a big dust up, it can just be, I'm annoyed because, my brother said X, Y, Z, is you're usually not using the frontal part of your brain. The amygdala kicks in, which is, the fight or flight. And it's like, well, he said that again. And you just instantly want to fire back. Whereas I think one of the hardest things I learned a number of years ago was exactly what you talked about. Be curious, is taking that pause to be able to go, okay, Joe said, you're an a-hole, Ben. You should have picked up that stuff while you're in town. Instead of firing it back going, well, you didn't bloody tell me I should have. It's to stop and go, okay, why should I have picked it up for in town? Or can you help me understand X, Y, Z? And that curiosity, I think, is very important, but it's one of the hardest ones I've found to do. So is there any tricks from your point of view, not tricks or methods or ways, hints on, you get into that, but because it's this plaque thing, like resentment, and that builds up. So your brain instantly interprets something being said as bad due to historical reasons. How do we get around that?
You've just hit on something. I love that question, and I will get to it. You've just hit something really important, though. We've made it mean. We are meaning-making machines. And when people speak to us, we make meaning of it from our version of the world. And so the hint and tip, so that's just really important. I want you to realize that, and the listeners, that whenever we receive information, we are making meaning of it every single second. Now, that meaning that we're making of it can be true or untrue. How many times have you had or heard people have conversations and they will argue, but they're saying the same thing, right? They'll argue, but they've made it mean this, but actually that's not what it means at all. They don't mean that thing. For example, Aaron said to me once, my husband said to me once, he goes, Katie, well, hurry up, go and do it. Now, that's just a comment that he made. Now, if you know my husband, he's very direct. He just says things and move on. As a woman, as a wife, as a mum, as a business owner, I had to pause. And you hit the nail on the head. You have to pause. If you want the hint of a lifetime, it's in taking that heartbeat between what's been said and how you've interpreted it to how you then express it. So in that moment, I felt all of those feelings like, excuse me? Who are you to say this? What do you mean? I work really hard. And so I was going on with all these stories inside my thinking. I hadn't said anything yet. And then I asked myself a question. So here's the second step. First step is pause. You got to take the heartbeat because that response is an automatic reaction. So take a heartbeat. Now you love your family, so you can take a heartbeat. I know that there could be some people out there who don't like silence. However, silence can be your biggest gift. Just pause. The second thing that I did was then ask myself a question. What does he mean by that? Now, I had, of course, the bird up Katie, the response that I was like my initial.
I'm guessing your face was red as a beetroot.
I was in dismay. I was like, what do you mean? Took that heartbeat. What does that mean? And then I asked this question. What else could that mean? And so I start to play with the possibility of what else could it mean? It means that he thinks I'm really good at what I do. Go. It means that it's a really fabulous idea. Go, get it done. I don't know about you, but which one feels better to actually believe? The story that I'd made up that was responsive, or something more empowering that made me go, you know what, I am. Yeah, you're right. I am going to go and do it.
Yeah, well, that's the meaning you attach, isn't it? I mean, you can look at it from an optimistic point of view or a pessimistic point of view when you communicate with someone. And if you've built up that, difficulty in communication, you're instantly going to go for the pessimistic view of what the person means. And, Elon Musk had a quote a little while ago that resonated beautifully with me. He said, I'd rather be an optimist and wrong than a pessimist and right. And I think in communication, that's so true. We'd rather be, that person meant this. But did they really? Yeah.
Is that true? Is that true?
And if you can ask yourself, what else could that mean? I mean, that's a powerful question, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And when it comes to this, there are times where there's going to be troublesome communication. We're not saying that it's always smooth sailing. And that's the beautiful thing about it is we are never, ever aiming to be perfect in communication. What we want to be aiming for is flexibility in communication, because what we believe and what I encourage my students is that we believe the person with the most flexibility wins.
Well, also too, Kate, I think that's a really important point. So flexibility, the person wins. I had a client say to me years ago who was an exceptional project manager. He was so young and so high up in his career. And he said to me one day, he said, Ben, he who loses his cool first loses the argument. And so every negotiation he ever went into, it didn't matter whether someone was screaming at him because he was in the construction industry, calling him every name under the sun. He'd just coolly look at them and go, well, I'm not doing it. Or, well, that's what I need you to do. And I think that's great. The most flexible and the calmest will actually win. And I think that's a really good point for families is because we naturally blow up. And if we can actually calm ourselves down or practice being able to keep calm under pressure, especially in communication, you're going to get so much of a better outcome.
Something that I want to add to that is when we're feeling really revved up on the inside, when we're feeling fiery or when you're feeling hurt or whatever the emotion is that you're feeling in that moment, is yes, it's about the flexibility of communication. And what creates that? It's the curiosity. You stay in calmness when you're curious because there's no judgment.
Help me understand.
Yeah, help me understand. Or how do I understand? Take ownership of it. I wonder what I'm missing. I wonder what it is that I haven't quite gathered. Maybe I need to ask another question. Maybe I need to say it differently. Maybe actually, you know what? This person looks like they're hurting. I wonder what they need right now. Maybe I just need to leave this and actually deal with what's going on for this person. So I think it's really about the communication and being curious in that communication. So that's the flexibility and that's how they can stay calmer. Because in those moments where you're heated, the last thing you want someone to say to you is calm down. Like, Katie, calm down.
Yeah, that works at home for me all the time.
Yeah. Right. Someone says calm down to me. It's like a red flag to a bull. What? But if someone says to me, I wonder how you could be more curious about this, I'll go into curiosity and it just depletes the emotion for me personally. It just takes the heated emotion out of it.
So it does. So you find when you're in a situation that does, set you off, so to speak, that by saying, okay, it's like mentally forcing yourself to take a pause and in your head going, okay, I need to be more curious. what else could this mean? What am I missing? How could I better understand that? Literally turns off the emotional response or dampens down the emotional response enough to then be able to communicate better.
Yes. And I don't force it. I choose it.
Okay.
Yep. So I choose to pause. And even if I'm feeling frustrated, I'm not denying that I'm feeling frustrated. I don't try and suppress the emotion. It's not bypassing that. It's actually just shifting my focus, going from the emotional brain into something that's more curious. And that will just lower all of that emotional state. Now, do I always get to a zero? No. But can I get to a place where exactly what you said, which is where you can have an actual constructive conversation with somebody rather than a firefight? We don't want a blazing fire. What we want is that ebb and flow between the two.
And I've got a statement, not a question here, Kate, but one thing that I think is a really good question that I quite often ask myself is, what's the outcome I actually want here? So if, for example, if it was, say, my dad and I was having an argument with my dad, well, do I actually want to have an argument, or do I want to resolve this? Or do I want to be right, or do I want to be happy? That's another really important one. And I think if we can ask ourselves those questions, what the outcomes we're trying to achieve here, that reframes things. Because I think naturally as humans, and especially type A personality, driven, hardworking, I'm working flat out, I'm doing everything I can, I've got a million things on my plate. The instant thing is I just got to plow through this, and I've just got to get it. I don't have time for this rubbish. So slowing things down and asking those better questions can be valuable. Now, Kate, I'd like to switch over a little bit here and then go on to the mind, because I think we're running up towards the end now, but I'd like to go back to that point you made earlier about communication is not only how you communicate outwards, but it's also how you communicate with yourself. So that's the narrative that's going on in your head, or the conversation that's going on in your head. Can you unpack or sort of flesh out that a little bit for us?
Yeah, so we have over 70,000 thoughts per day.
Geez, I reckon I probably have 140,000 a day.
Yeah, well, you're right. Some of us do have more than others, but we have a lot of thoughts going on in our mind. The challenge is that a lot of them become unconscious. We don't actually realize that we have these conversations going on inside of our thinking. If we ask the audience right now, how many other conversations are going on for you right now inside your thinking, inside your mind, whilst Ben and I are talking?
I refuse to answer that question myself.
Yeah, right? Like there's all these things that are going on. Now, what we need to know is that there's 70,000 plus or minus of these thoughts going on in our head. 90% of them are recycled. 90% of them are thoughts that we keep thinking over and over and over and over and over again. Now, if we think about this, if we practice, if I have a weight in my hand, like a dumbbell, and I lift that on my arm, what's going to happen? If I keep lifting that day after day and I just do it unconsciously and I walk around all day and I'm just lifting with my left arm, what's going to happen to me? I'm going to become really strong in my left arm, aren't I? So if I have negative thoughts in my mind, if I have thoughts about all the things that aren't working, if I have thoughts about all the things where I'm unhappy, about all the problems that can happen, if I have that focus and I'm lifting and flexing that muscle of doubt, of worry, of concern, of stress,
anger,
of all of these, anger,
resentment.
Yeah, resentment. Look at us right at the same time. If I'm flexing that muscle all the time, what's going to happen? It's going to become stronger. So we need to be understanding that the thoughts that we think are going to influence everything outside of us. Now, everything. It's going to influence the relationships we have. It's going to influence our productivity. It's going to influence our decision-making and how we move forward. It's going to be, we know when we're angry, we make more mistakes. We know that. So if I flex the muscle of anger all the time, how many mistakes am I going to make that if I was actually flexing the muscles of curiosity, of courage, right? Of love, of compassion, of thoughtfulness, of a different energy, of a forward focus on what else is possible in curiosity. And so when it comes to our mind, we can have a dirty mind and we can be walking through our thoughts every single day and have our muddy boots on, or we can choose to shift that, because it literally comes down to a choice. Now, is this choice easy to move? Sometimes it's a bit trickier. That's why we get support. Yeah, that's why we get people to help us. That's why we ask people to walk us through or unpack things with us. But the words that you say inside of your mind are the things you're going to get more of. You're going to become stronger in that part. So we need to be mindful of, pay attention to the words that you say, the conversations that you're having in here. If you think that that person is being a real pain, let's use that word, if you think that they're being a pest or a pain or whatever it is, you're going to see all of that in that person. And so that's going to keep continuing that momentum. So we just need to be really mindful of what are we actually fueling and seeding in our mind. Just like in a paddock, you don't go and purposely plant a paddock full of weeds, right? You don't go into your lucerne crop or your cotton crop or whatever it is and plant seeds in there of weeds that are things that are going to come through and destroy that crop. We are really meticulous. And we make sure that we are doing whatever we can to have the crop come through without the weeds, without the pests. And so when it comes to our mind, when it comes to our thinking, we need to be just as vigilant, because what goes on in here becomes an expression. Our thoughts create our emotions create our behavior, and our behavior creates our result. And then our result feeds our thoughts. And so if we're planting the seeds of possibility, if we're planting the seeds of appreciation, of gratitude, of thankfulness, of courage, of curiosity, if we're planting those seeds, I'm curious what would happen to someone's life. How would that dramatically improve if they flex that muscle instead every day and they're mindful of it? Because it's this mindful thought processes so that you can have mindful conversations, so that you can have the relationships, so that you can create the fortune, so that you can have the family dynamics actually work together rather than against each other. It all starts in here.
Yeah, it's interesting, Kate. I think I've said that 100 times today because I'm concurring with everything you're saying. You're the expert, but I think, to me, listening to you, the first place someone can start is what's going on in their head. So start really focusing on how are you viewing the world, how are you viewing the communication and the interactions, and then asking yourself some better questions. What's the outcome you want to achieve? Is dad really a cantankerous old bugger, or is he just scared, or is my son just an angry young man, or is he just frustrated? How do we ask better questions, and then you'll approach the communication in a much better way. I think that's really important. And it's funny, I believe every family needs to have their own communication ninja. So they need to have someone in the family that becomes the champion of the family communication to be able to keep the family unit whole. Because the secret to succession, in my eyes, and maintaining family wealth across generations is having a strong financial position. So financial strength in the family, but also a strength of the family unit. And someone needs to take that leadership role. And anyone who's got young kids might have seen that movie Encanto, which came out a few years ago. It was a Disney movie. And essentially the story behind that was everyone in the family got superpowers or magical powers, and this one girl didn't. And, when she turned 18, she didn't get powers and she thought she was no use to the family. But what actually happens, through the movie, it beautifully showed this whole story about how in the end she figured out her superpower was her communication and her love and her ability to bring the family and hold the family together, which was an amazing story. So I think everyone needs a communication ninja. If people in your family aren't communicating well, work on yourself first. Look at that in a dialogue, etc. Now, we're rapidly running out of time. I could talk about this for days, and I know you do a lot of training in this space, Kate. You do multiple days. I've seen you do it. I've done this communication training with other people. I've seen you at your best, and I think you're one of the best I've ever seen. So do you just want to take a few minutes to just tell us about what you do and how you go about it, Kate? I'd love for everyone to hear that.
Appreciate it. It's been awesome to have you in our training room as well. My biggest passion in life is to bridge the gap in the communication between practitioners personally and also with their clients. And so my mission in this world is to have echoes of language and communication filter and elevate the experience of life for people personally and professionally. And so our trainings really focus on their 6-day trainings that we go through, where we immerse you in understanding the human mind, in understanding human behavior, and how can you better understand yourself so that you can then communicate more effectively, more efficiently, more profoundly with those around you, despite where you're from in the world. And that's what we aim for. We aim to have it embedded in who you become, so that, like you just said a moment ago, you get to lead by example in your family and actually break chains of miscommunication and build change of connection and communication in your space.
And build trust, I think, is the number one thing in family, because we talked about communication, but it becomes a breakdown in trust. And trust is not just about, do I trust that John won't steal my money when I leave it on the counter? I mean, do I trust them with my emotions? Do I trust them to do the right thing? Do I trust them to treat me well? And when you say practitioners, can you just unpack that a little bit for me, Kate?
Oh, yeah, sorry. So when we talk about practitioners, it's people in the health and wellness space. We have coaches, consultants, we have nutritionists, we have naturopaths, osteopaths, homeopathy, PTs, anyone that's helping people become better at their health. We give them the communication tools and techniques and strategies in order for them to elevate their communication so that they get better results.
And the interesting part is that you're specialising and tailoring your courses, I suppose you'd say, to the wellness and medical type space, but the skills that you're teaching people are essentially the same skills that a plumber would use, a farmer would use, a politician would use. They're multifaceted skills.
Yeah, and the beautiful thing, a lot of our practitioners who come through, a lot of the people who come through our trainings, they actually come in saying that they just wanted it for their professional life. But what they find is the profound difference that they have in their personal life with their family dynamics. And that, for me, is what it's all about. It's all about the impact, the ripple effect.
And it's interesting. People come to me usually, Katie, because I'm the financial bloke, and I've got the business agri-coach, so we help farming families, but they come a lot of the time because of financial questions about how do we grow our wealth, how do we protect it, how do we transition it. But ultimately what it comes down to is those two things, which is financial strength and family strength. So about at least 50% of what I end up, seeing problems in the family that need to be fixed that can help them maintain or increase their family's prosperity and maintain it across the generations is communication. So this is an absolute critical topic. And I think, to put it really bluntly, the vast majority of people that I say come with succession issues, it's seldom a financial, a tax, a legal issue. It's usually a communication and strategic planning problem. And so they go to their accountant, they go to their lawyer, and they say, can you fix this for us? And this is not denigrating at accountants and lawyers. They're integral to it, but they can fix the financial and the legal and the tax problems, but they're not always skilled to be able to fix the communication. And that's where people need to devote an appropriate amount of time. And my advice to most of the people that I run into that have these problems is you need to get someone in to be able to help you with that. And that's why there's facilitators and people that operate in that space. So I think it's absolutely critical. Just before we wind up, two last quick questions. Katie, number one is there any final tips you want to give? Because I know I always like to come off with something really, really hot that people can implement afterwards before we wind up, and then we'll get into the last question.
Yeah, listen, for me, when it comes to communication in family dynamics, is give yourself the heartbeat, to be honest, because the way you want to leave a mark on people in your family, you want to leave a legacy, then it all comes with you investing in how you communicate with those that are around you. How do you understand them and how do they understand you? And so the hot tip is literally start working on it now.
No, that's great advice. Great advice. Where can people find more about you online, Katie? And we'll put these in the show notes.
Yeah, perfect. They can find out more by going to my website, which is www.pinkdiamondinstitute.com, or they can find me on Facebook under Katie Godden.
Katie Godden. I'll put those in the show notes so everyone can get access to it. Now, if you could go back in a time machine, Katie, to your 20s, early 20s, mid 20s, late 20s, whatever you want to do, and you could sit down with your 20-something-year-old self, put your arm around them and say, come here, young lady, I need to give you some tips before I bugger off back to the future, what would you tell the younger version of you?
It's such a beautiful question, isn't it, to go back? What I would tell myself is I would just sit with her and say, you know what? Trust yourself and stay curious in life and you'll go far. That's all you need.
Beautiful. I like it. I'm not sure 20-something-year-old Kate would have listened, but just like 20-something-year-old Ben probably wouldn't have. But I think the advice is beautiful. The interesting part is that if 55-year-old Katie jumped in a time machine and came back to where you are right now, I'm pretty sure they'd probably give you the same advice.
Yeah, probably. And in our own wisdom, we get to choose, right? We get to choose.
Exactly. Perfect. Excellent. Yeah. Well, that's been amazing. I've got a whole page of notes here. I'd highly recommend anyone listening go back and have a listen to this again because there's some real gold nuggets in there. I know I will be. I'm looking forward to editing this once it comes back from my editor, Sam. Shout out to the podcast butler. Does a great job. So thanks very much for your time, Katie. And I reckon there's about 100 episodes we could do here in the future if we can.
Absolutely love it.
Well, I don't know about you, but I love listening to my sister talk about communication and building those skills over time. And I just want to make the point that communication is one of those skills that needs to be built over time and needs to be maintained. One thing that I recognized, which was really important, was when I retired from financial advice, took a year off and then hit COVID. My communication skills deteriorated over that time. And when I got back on deck and started interacting with people again and recording the podcast, I was really shocked at how it had deteriorated. So just remember, it's a never-ending learning process on how to be a better communicator. Now, there's a couple of things I want to touch on here that just to reinforce before we go, if you just take a few minutes with me. Number one, pause. Take a heartbeat between what you heard, what you interpreted, and how you react. Very difficult to do in a heated family situation, but that's the skill that you need to practice. And it won't be easy, but start off with a little chunk, which is if we have some communication issues, take a pause and don't react. Number two, notice when you're communicating with someone, if there's some problems going on, what actually happens, how they react, and then think about how you could have approached it differently. Potentially that could be a question. Help me understand, Dad, why you seem to get so upset whenever I ask about succession. I'm a little bit confused. Can you help me understand? Those sorts of things. Next, curiosity. Kate banged on about how important curiosity is. Instead of making a statement, ask a question. I struggle with that one. You hear it in the podcast all the time. I make statements and then ask questions. I've been practicing over the last couple of years is being more and more curious. And I think you could never get curious enough about things. And a simple question to ask to be more curious is, tell me more about XYZ. Another question you could possibly ask is, what am I missing? What else could that mean? If someone says something to you, could there be a different meaning to it? And the analogy I used was Elon Musk, which is, I'd rather be an optimist and wrong than a pessimist and right. You need to think about when you are communicating with the family is, you've interpreted what they've said, but could it mean something else? And I think it would be far more advantageous for you if you looked at it from an optimistic point of view rather than a pessimistic point of view. You could also ask yourself is, what's the outcome you want to achieve here? I think that's a killer question. If I'm having this discussion, do I want to fight? Do I want to work this out? Do I want to move forward? Do I want to win at all costs? And really have that honest conversation with yourself. And the last thing on that topic was, Katie said, is, we have 70,000 thoughts a day, and the vast majority of those are recycled. So we need to be really conscious of what are we telling ourselves when these conversations are happening. And just remember, the final thing I want to tie off is the most flexible communicator is the one that wins. I think those were the words Katie used. And then I gave the analogy of the ex-client of mine that, he who loses his cool first loses the argument. I think both of those are really important in a family situation. Be flexible, be curious. Don't focus on trying to fix the other person. Fix yourself and don't lose your cool. And you can practice that skill. Well, that's it. How to become a communication ninja. We've scratched the surface. I've given you some key things to think about. Get on the journey. Start improving it. Be your family communication ninja. And if you've got any questions, reach out to me, ben@thefinancialbloke.com.au. Like us on the socials. Share the podcast as far and wide as you possibly can. We'd all appreciate it. That's it for today. I'll catch up with you next time.